Hi, and welcome to Friday Harbor Film Festival 2021. You've joined us here with our guest, which is she is Jennifer Lee with actually Jennifer 8, forgive me, Lee. She is one of the founders of EMOJI Nation, which was founded in 2015. Just an amazing film if you haven't seen it. The EMOJI Story, I got to see it today, and it's really mind expanding. Thank you for joining us here today, Jennifer.
I'm excited. I'm excited to be here. We actually just came. I'm in San Francisco, and yesterday, the last 3 days were actually the Unicode conference, the annual Unicode conference, where
Oh,
we got obviously it was like canceled. The in-person version was canceled in 2020. This was in person, and the
wow.
swag they kind of gave out to us was I
Oh,
probably have it. Actually, was let me see if I have it. They gave us little masks with the emoji of the mask on it. It was great. It was cute. It was very
that's
meta.
great. That's smart. What amazing timing. So that conference just happened.
Yeah, literally. I finished a lightning talk yesterday at 5 p.m. Pacific
Huh,
time, and then
fantastic.
and then came up here. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So I'm just curious to know how you were involved in the making of this film. I know you're the producer of it. Can you tell us how that came about, how you were involved in that?
Yeah. So I had worked with Ian Cheney on one of the directors on a film called The Search for General So that came out in 2014, and so this was in 2015. I had gone down this like rabbit hole of trying to figure out like why there was no dumpling emoji. In large part because dumplings are a universal food. Um, there's ravioli and pierogi and khinkali and gyoza. And it had come up during a texting conversation I had with a designer named Ying Liu, who is like a famed designer, and also Chinese Australian American. So all kinds of things going on there. And we were just like, texting about the fact I was making dumplings. I sent her a photo, and then she like texted back, yum 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 yum, knife and fork, knife and fork, knife and fork, and then there was like this pause, and she's like, oh, Apple doesn't have a dumpling emoji, and I was like, oh, that's weird. How is there no dumpling emoji? Um, because dumplings, like I said, are this universal food. Like every society seems to have its equivalent of like yummy goodness inside a carbohydrate shell with like whether or not it's steamed, fried, or baked. And I like just started exploring like how could there be no dumpling emoji given the universality of emoji and the universality of dumplings, like together you would feel like that definitely should exist. And so I went down this rabbit hole, first googling like like how do you add an emoji, and you find this Unicode consortium, which is this large or it's not large, right? It's it's the opposite of large. It is a small nonprofit based in Mountain View, California, of whom many of the members are these large U.S. multinational tech companies. So Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple. And I, kind of like, virtually was like, I'm going to get this dumpling emoji. And kind of just like went down this bizarre little rabbit hole of like these people who like regulate emoji, many of whom are now in the documentary. And I just texted. Must have been like, this must have been January, December. It was, I know kind of roughly because Ian had just had a child. And so it's exactly as old as the baby, or who's now not a baby. And it was really quite stunning because now we know exactly how long we've been working on it by the size of this child. And I was just like, how do you feel about emoji? Let's do it. Like, would you want to do a documentary on emoji? And he was like, yeah. So it was just sort of this like little quixotic world. And then he brought on Martha, who's one of our friends. And then the three of us basically kind of, raised some money and then started filming and raised more money. I mean, the process of doing a documentary is like raising money, filming, raising more money, filming. That's seen as a very iterative process. And, Martha has won an Emmy for a documentary called After Tiller. Ian has a Peabody for, I think, King Corn. And so it was just really fun to kind of, I had a lot of inside knowledge of the process from my time, trying to become part of the Unicode consortium as an individual member, and then founding Emoji Nation and getting the rights, the right to kind of become part of the committee. And then I'm one of the vice chairs of the committee. There are many of us, there are 3 of us. And so, just kind of had a lot of thoughtful exploration with how to do the whole emoji process.
So interesting. So was Emoji Nation a product of what you learned along the way in making this film?
It's probably the other way. I think Emoji Nation started first and was a little bit tongue in cheek. It was this whole idea of emoji by the people for the people. And aim to bring the voice of the people into the room. Now the Zoom on issues of emoji, and and it we started with a Kickstarter campaign and raised like $12,000, and then basically worked on it for a while. And we got the dumpling and takeout box and fortune cookies and chopsticks passed, and those were all done by Ying Lu, and I wrote the proposal, she did the designs, we got them through in January 2016. Actually, back then, we didn't even know what we would be filming. Like, we didn't know, like, the voice of the film, like, was it about me and Ying, was it about me and, maybe there wasn't going to be anything particularly interesting. But then in August of 2016, we had the hijab emoji proposal sent in. And when I saw that, I was like, I think we have one of our characters for our film, who's Rayouf Al-Humaidi. And it's because I was involved in the process and could see these proposals come in that I could sort of coordinate with the directors and the subjects and doing these, basically finding good characters to shoot.
Mm-hmm. And you were at that time privy to some suggestions that were coming in from all over for emojis at that time.
Yeah, I would say a couple things are going on. So one is we knew people who could propose emoji and then could follow them, right? So like if someone we met wanted to do an emoji, then we could work with them and then know that they were going to be very good characters. And then on the other side, we sometimes knew who had submitted and then could see if they were good characters. And so at the end of the documentary, where you see a sort of an interesting montage of people, a lot of those people were at one point considered to be larger characters, like the marijuana emoji, for example. Not every story is compelling enough to sort of hold a narrative across a feature-length documentary. And so these were the 3 that we felt kind of represented a good cross-section of the world and good cross-section of results and a good cross-section of sort of story and background and stuff.
Did you know when you started out on this track that it was going to become a story about diversification?
I think no. At the point that I first texted Ian, which may have been probably about December 2015, I think I was just like, this is a weird, quirky world of like these people making all these decisions. And the early kind of proposals of, that we had for our funders had more maybe like a vignette kind of approach to it. And been like maybe 12 stories and would have like hopped around. And it was only when we had our characters and we kind of were like, oh, we could sustain these people over a number of beats. Did it kind of focus on issues of representation? I would say, there could have been like a very intellectual approach to emoji where maybe you looked at the designers, maybe you looked at like, the history of like visual languages, blah, 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 blah. It could have been like very like chapter like. Of course, that's tricky for its own way structurally in terms of sustaining a narrative kind of forward momentum. So, we definitely kind of had to, there's a lot of editing for a documentary like this because it both, there's 3 narratives going forward. We're also trying to give a lot of context, and there are worse cuts of this documentary from earlier, and I think now it landed in a very solid place that we've had a lot of good feedback on.
I would actually love to see those things that were cut from the film. I learned so much in watching it, and it really was mind expanding for me, as I said earlier. It really was. In just the different professional opinions about the evolution of language,
Yeah.
there's another fascinating aspect of your film. Did you know that was going to come about?
Um, That's an interesting question. I would say generally, I didn't know what the revelations would be, but I know just from my past experience that once you start thinking about a topic, so I've done a lot of research on Chinese food in America. You get insights because you look so intensely at a topic.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most interesting revelations that came out of like doing this documentary is the struggle of so many people to get images about themselves that basically look like themselves. And I was like, this is so perplexing. I was like always just so struck. Like people wanted to be redheads, people wanted curly hair, people wanted bald, people wanted skin tones, people wanted gender neutral. And it was only in talking to the experts that they kind of put the idea in my head that you know emoji have certain language like qualities, like they're pretty good at like verbs that are action oriented, they're good at nouns that are objects, but they do not have the word I and you. In whereas in almost every spoken language, that's probably one of the first kind of concepts that is introduced. And the way of saying I and you visually um, is really hard. So the way that most people now like say it is in the third, what I would say like a third party representation of themselves,
Mm-hmm.
something that looks like themselves, and that demand is fascinating and probably
Mm-hmm.
unsustainable from a encoding standpoint in the Unicode framework of the world. Which is not to say that it won't evolve later on, but
Mm-hmm.
with the concepts that we have, what we call like memoji, or like people can make little avatars, whether or not bitmoji or something else. So
Right.
I've been really fascinated by like this like visceral desire for people to represent themselves in the world of emoji, and the way that they feel seen is to see that representation of something that looks like them. And that's kind of weird, it's like, like it definitely wasn't something that I thought about in the beginning, but this idea also of like, we always talk about representation on the big screen and like Oscar so wide and seeing yourself represented in like media, but emoji are like seeing yourself represented on the little screen. And in terms of like hours spent per day, like we probably spend more times at this point looking at the little screen as opposed to the big screen.
Mm-hmm.
And people also want to see themselves represented in the little screen, which is to say like emoji.
Mm-hmm. So there was a part in the film where they're talking about how much is enough, and is it sustainable, as you mentioned, to have a
Yeah.
representation of every single person on the planet. And what is your opinion of what will happen? Will it become larger, or will it become more simplified?
So I think that within some amount of reasonable future, they will develop the technology that can compose font-like images on the fly, maybe, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, for many of the platforms, that is not the case. So the Googles and Apples of this world, for every like family emoji or they have literally an image that like kind of like maps to the zeros and ones. So you can see this series of zeros and ones. I'm going to go pull this image. Microsoft is different. Microsoft actually, if you ever look at their emoji, they're very flat looking. They do not look realistic. They look like very cartoony, like
Mm-hmm.
kind of very much like a color book
Mm-hmm.
take on it. And Microsoft technology is different because what they do is they actually draw the black outline and then fill in the colors. So for them, they can do interracial families in ways that like someone where they pull an image for every single variation of gender and number of children and color. Like if you kind of do all the families and all the different variations, you're over like 3,500 just for families, right? Whereas Microsoft is able to handle it because you're like, okay, we're going to draw the family. Like, there's still the issue of like how many kids and like the genders. But once you have that, we're just going to make dark, dark, light, 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 or like dark, light, or dark, more dark, light, 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 or they have the ability to compose more on the fly. So I think if people can figure out that technology, we will see little text-based or like text embeddable images that can go out. Because the idea is, on some level, we can send little images, but people don't like the little images because you can't use them in it's hard. You can't use them in a subject like of an email. Like it's very much dependent on the ability to send and receive images. When you're sending and receiving emoji, there's no image that's going back and forth. It's ones and zeros. So on one side, it's like, I have this image. This is the series of zeros and ones. That thing gets transmitted, and on the other side, they're like, oh, okay, this series of zeros and ones, I'm going to pull this like font. So in some, if you were talking between Apple and Google, sometimes those images are a little different. Sometimes they're very different because the way that they've decided to represent that series of zeros and ones, while they both have the same name or the same like neutral like thing that they refer to in emoji land and Unicode, they've interpreted them very different. So one example, sort of the classic example, is Apple has the two ladies in bunny ears dancing side by side because it's like, cool party. But on the Android side, because it was working with a different Japanese carrier, it's just one woman, portrait style, bunny ears, and that says something very, very different, right? As opposed to like, let's party, just one emoji with kind of waist up or like chest up with bunny ears. And I see the logic why you would want to map those together, but it's not consistent between the two platforms. And right now, all the companies are trying to like iron out so that they get rid of their inconsistencies, whether or not it's like the eyes are swirly or X's for dizzy face, or like when you're like there's one emoji that's like with your hand over their mouth, or is it like hand over mouth in horror, like or hand over mouth like smiling hee hee. So some of those have not been consistent across all of the different companies, and they're trying to get that through.
And so far, from what I understand from your film, that is happening, right? It's becoming universal.
I think they're trying to get some consistency. I think it's very bad for everyone when, different emoji are different. So like a good example is a couple of years ago, Apple flipped its gun emoji, which looked very much like a gray steel gun, to something which was more playful, a green water pistol. So then suddenly you have a gun emoji on like a gray gun, like violent gun on, Android and Microsoft and like Facebook, and then Apple has this like play gun. And so remember, underneath they're the same character. So if you're sending the play gun from here, over here it's showing up as a gun. And so over time, everyone has become consistent. Another one where people are not consistent, which is a little bit like tragic from my perspective, is I helped someone propose a kneeling emoji many years ago. And the original proposal is a person on one knee. And so the person who had written the proposal was inspired by Colin Kaepernick. And Android kept it with one knee, and the other vendors have ended up with two knees, which is a completely different like connotation, right? It's like almost the opposite in some ways. So that inconsistency, I think, needs to be ironed out over time as well.
It really brings awareness just to our own body language between each other. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, totally.
Amazing.
Yeah, anyway.
So what do you think the purpose of, we're talking about, how difficult it is to get an emoji passed through this pretty much governing body, right? What is the purpose, do you think, between that regulation of the emoji?
So in terms of what the purpose of the regulation is, or why?
Is it like language where you have a standardized, language, for instance?
I would say just in most places around the world, or historically, language is very organic. It's very bottoms up. There's some sort of examples of like where, their national bodies, whether not in France or China, that kind of make decisions. But people are going to do what people are going to do. And what I think one of the most interesting things about emoji is that even though there is a regulatory body deciding what characters appear, how those characters as emoji are used evolves very quickly over time and with different with different generations and just like different like subpopulations. So an
Mhm.
example that I've
Right.
read about is I think the skull emoji. For me as an older person, it means death. Um,
Mhm.
but so I hear from from folks for a Gen Z population, it means that is so funny. I'm dying laughing, right? So the
Oh
death
my
becomes
gosh.
actually very much like rolling on the floor laughing, like but so hard that you're dying, and that's like I'm like, where did that come from? But like that's just something that a different group of people have found meaning on around that kind of
Mhm.
emoji. um, and I like that kind of idea that like the meaning can kind of shift over time as long as it's understood within a subpopulation. You know,
Mhm.
so yeah.
It's amazing. So, what overall, what would you hope that your audience takes away from this film?
So there are a couple things that I find interesting. So one is individual people can impact billions of people. So these are persons that like were very passionate, and there was a venue for them to sort of take their passion and like impact the world. So that's one. Um, Two, I think it's interesting to see these technology companies who have such impact over our ability to communicate on a day-to-day basis, whether or not it's you know Facebook or Twitter, whether or not it's emoji, in terms of like both what can be said and not said on a certain platform because of like hate speech or other kinds of concerns about bully, all of that. So they have huge impact in terms of how the the ways and the places that we can communicate. They also have a lot of impact in terms of like evolving the characters that we can kind of communicate with. And then they
Mhm.
also and they are companies that skew, at least until now, skew Silicon Valley and tech. Microsoft is technically not in Silicon Valley, it's closer to you guys out in Friday Harbor, but it is Silicon Valley or tech in spirit. And those populations skew very engineering, skew very West Coast, skew American, skew male, and we just think maybe like collectively should think or want to think like, how do you open up the conversation to larger folks, especially those who don't have the ability to like spend all the time working on these like regulatory issues. I just was happened to be lucky in that like I was able to go to the first meeting that was advertised on the Unicode like email list because I happened to be in town and like happened to have a couple of hours free those days. So I went for that.
Amazing. It's
Mhm.
amazing. Well, it certainly does raise awareness. It raises awareness of diversity, how we communicate with each other,
Mhm.
how important it is that we feel we are appropriately represented, and also about the evolution of language. I just felt that especially fascinating. I'm in awe.
Thank
What?
you.
Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you. So, what? If I can just ask, what? What personal lessons did you learn along the way? That's kind of a general question.
No, there's a lot. I mean, it's always also tricky because like how much of it was about the journey around the documentary itself versus the fact that like while I was making the documentary, I was asked to be one of the vice chairs of Unicode emoji subcommittee. So I went from being like outside like shaking my fist and inside you know kind of being part of the system but trying to advocate from within. I think in terms of just so that entire process, what really strikes me is how how regulatory bodies work, and that they both can be very rule based and sometimes surprisingly idiosyncratic, and that there are a lot of personalities that are at play, and there's a lot of like interpersonal dynamics that sometimes can like surprise you. and impact what happens in terms of like, a standard that's rolled out across the world. So, there were a lot of interviews that we did that didn't make it into the documentary, but, a lot of like, there's a middle finger emoji, for example. And like one person advocated for that. That is not actually an emoji that came from the Unicode side. That came from like the International Standards Organization side, which always has to sync with Unicode. And you're like, oh, like one person felt really strongly, and they got it. They got it. So it's these kind of very large issues that can like individual personalities can disproportionately impact them, relative to what your expectations would be. So like we see this in legislation, but like, it's like very serious, in America, where like different senators can like hold up things. This is like it's sort of like both like a micro version and a macro version, in the sense that, it's not a legislative body. No one's elected in a, official democratic sense, but at the same time, it impacts billions of people around the world.
It's incredible. Well, I just want to thank you, Jennifer. We have been delighted in speaking with Jennifer Lee. She's one of the founders of EMOJI Nation, founded in 2015. If you have not seen this movie, I strongly recommend you do so. It will expand your mind. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you. Bye.